well, to assess Fidel Castro's impact on Africa and how he'll be remembered there. I'm joined now in the studio by the award-winning African Affairs analyst, James Woods. Good to see you, James. What have Africans been saying about the impact of Cuba under Fidel Castro now that the great man has passed? How are they remembering him?
Well, I think Africa and Cuba hold a very special place together. The reason for this goes back to the time of apartheid, where Cuba was absolutely beneficial and important, was seminal to the fight to end apartheid. So most African countries hold this very dear to themselves. When the Western powers were still promoting, like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, were promoting the apartheid regime, there was Fidel Castro assisting them in the liberation movements in Angola, in Mozambique, actually helped with numerous other places, DRC. So I think that is very central to Africans, it's the memory that they hold. And the founding fathers of Africa hold that very dearly to themselves, that they were able to achieve success due to the support he gave, both militarily, both in education, both in medical support, both in education and literacy levels, and also trying to ensure that the new states that will be formed had the right personnel in those governments as such.
Yes, because of course a lot of people forget that Cuba's involvement in Africa wasn't just political or military, it was also humanitarian, dating just 2 years ago when they sent hundreds of doctors to help fight the Ebola virus in West Africa.
Yes, with the Ebola virus in West Africa, there was a situation whereby the WHO required 10,000 medical doctors. Cuba offered over 400 medical doctors to go there and assist. It was actually the largest number sent by any country. And whilst some of the Western nations were still reeling, wondering about the effect, they weren't doing anything. It was only when two American nationals fell ill that this became a global phenomenon where help was starting to filter in. Cuba was there from the start, but they're also alongside African doctors there. But beyond West Africa, we look at the support they've done in Angola. Over 300,000 people were taught to read and write through initiatives promoted by Cuba, Fidel Castro. In South Africa, after the end of apartheid, a lot of people were trained in Cuba, from doctors to engineers for the mining sector. So they've been very beneficial in promoting some of the intelligence levels of individuals in Africa, promoting how they can move forward.
And we're looking at pictures of him now with Nelson Mandela. He was also close to people like Muammar Gaddafi. And that is what makes him controversial in Africa, isn't it? Because there is this sense that, here he is, rubbing shoulders with people who oppressed their own people. I mean, was Cuba's involvement in Africa part of that proxy war that was happening during the confrontation between the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union? Was that why Castro was in Africa in the first place?
Well, two things to that. Castro is a very divisive individual. You either love him or you hate him, depending on where you're standing and where you're monitoring him from. If you're monitoring from Africa, then yes, you see him as a person who has done great for Africa. As a proxy to Russia, just recently reports were declassified from the CIA, where we've actually seen that Cuba was actually in Africa against the wishes of the USSR. And beyond that, if you read Henry Kissinger's memoirs, he mentions in his last memoir, where he mentions that Fidel Castro is probably the truest revolutionary that he knew of, who remained true to his founding principles. So despite the criticisms of Kissinger, he went on to acknowledge that this man was true to what he believed in the solidarity and also promoting the liberation of Africa from the realms of apartheid, from the realms of colonialism.
Absolutely, because of course Cuba formed part of the vanguard of anti-colonialism, particularly in the Portuguese colonies, where Portugal remained recalcitrantly unmoved by the departure of Britain and France from their colonies. So that is one contribution that will be remembered, won't it?
Absolutely remembered. I think the defining battle will be, well, the Portuguese actually under apartheid regime as well, in Angola lost 2 battles to Fidel Castro, 1975-76, where we saw Angola gain independence, 1988 at the Battle of Quito Carnaval, which saw the South African-backed apartheid regime actually rescind itself, saw to the independence of Namibia. So we could actually argue on that part that that was one of the defining moments. And I think Nelson Mandela, even the late Nelson Mandela, mentioned that if it wasn't for the impact of Cuba intervening in Africa, the end of colonization within Africa would have actually taken a lot longer than it did. So they give a lot of thanks to Cuba and Fidel Castro for coming in at the time they did, spending over 3 decades in assisting Africa in terms of fighting the colonial powers.
And we give a lot of thanks to you, James Woods, the award-winning African Affairs analyst, for coming in to talk about Fidel Castro, a hero to many, a villain to many more. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Till ahead here on the Arise News Hour, all of your entertainment